And so there's a story here. There's the oldest story that mankind knows, and literally it is the oldest story that we know, is this story. And the story basically is there's a bounded space, a walled garden, a walled city, and all the original cities were walled, because if they weren't, barbarians would swoop in and they'd just steal all your stuff, and so that was kind of pointless. So you wanted to have some major league walls surrounding your territory, and so that's inhabited space, and inside that is your little dominance hierarchy. And so all you primates knew exactly who was who inside that space, so you didn't have to fight with each other, and you could predict each other's behavior because you believed the same things and saw the world roughly the same way and acted the same way, and so you were sort of secure. But then the problem is that that can always be breached. There's always something outside of it that's a danger, and so that's signified by this little creature here, this dragon. And that twirl in its tail is very common among dragons. It's actually a symbol, because imagistic languages, imagistic symbols have an ancient language, and it's referring to something that's basically eternal. And see, it lives down here in this cave, because it's an underground thing. It's an underground thing, and you can kind of imagine what that's like. And sometimes this happens in initiation rituals among archaic people. When they're going to initiate, usually the young men, because nature initiates women all by itself, usually the young men, maybe they'll put them in a cave and leave them there, for like, well, who knows how long. And so you got to think, what's in a cave? Now, caves are dark, man. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but like, they're dark, and they're really dark. And so not only is there whatever there is in the cave, and you don't know what the hell's in the cave, there's whatever you imagine might be in the cave. And so when you're in that cave and you're alone, you're confronting the devils and demons and monsters of your own imagination, and so then you have a chance to perhaps deal with that and overcome it, and that's perhaps part of the initiation ceremony, and that's part of growing up, because you have to learn how to face the things that terrify and upset you, and recast them and put them back together. We talked a little bit about this idea of the pre-cosmogonic chaos that Iliad refers to, and that's the stuff out of which order is produced at the beginning of time, and it's also the stuff out of which you constantly reproduce order. And the Jungians, the psychoanalysts, especially the really deep psychoanalysts like Jung, Freud was a more surface psychoanalyst, and that's not an insult. There's some things that Freud figured out that are absolutely amazing. He was a precursor to Jung for sure. For Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense that the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you, and to think it through and to articulate it, and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. If you read any history, if you really read it, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other, and we're so imaginative. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out, you can make it excruciating, you can take people apart physically and psychologically, and you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And that happens a hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh yes it does, man. That's the problem, because you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, But I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's like, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no. You know, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know. And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it, so it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, man, that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge, you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and, you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is, and how that's focused on you, and how everyone's rejected you, and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And then you end up shooting kids in Connecticut. And that's how you get there. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there. But you can go there, and people do. And they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you, you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed. And then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And so, like in your marriage and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, you know, ignorant and you're biased, and, you know, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good?